So when you see this blizzard and this video, you will perhaps immediately think that so winter has come, and that must be why you have so much ice in the fjord, in the sea. But this is one of the big counterintuitive things up here in Greenland, that although you have sea full of ice, or you have ice floating around in the fjord, this is not sea ice. This is actually land ice from the glacier, the bottom of the Nuuk Fjord. And as a matter of fact, I haven't seen a single case of sea ice for all the 15 months I've been in Greenland this far. But there is actually some truth to the point that winter is coming, and therefore you see this beautiful blue ice out in the fjord. And that point is that you have a, let's say, 100 or 150 kilometer long fjord, from all the way from here on the west coast and into the inland ice, where the Greenland Ice Sheet resides on top. And all of this ice comes from the inland ice sheet, and it all through spring and summer and autumn, it moves out. It calves off the glacier and it moves out towards the ocean, out through the Nuuk Fjord. But in spring and early summer, most of the ice actually melts out during its journey through the fjord. So it's actually only now in October that you really get a lot of icebergs floating in the fjord. That's because the ocean water is slightly cooler, so more of the bergs that calve off the glacier can actually survive all the way out to Nuuk and to this beautiful beach. But as I said, this is not sea ice, this is land ice. And the thing about sea ice is that sea ice is formed on the sea from salt water, more or less salty water. But when these bergs are already out at sea, they are of course counted as sea ice by the satellites and by the computer algorithms, because it's really kind of hard to say where this ice formed originally, and it mixes up with the sea ice also eventually. So I had one day here last February where there was some tendency to form pancake ice on the fjord, but all that was just swept away and melted out the very next morning. So it's like it just doesn't stick, the sea ice up here. Okay, so welcome back to Talking South, where this week we'll have a little bit more on the insanely deceptive IPCC Climate Report. And next week we will have an expert on the so-called methane bomb on this show. Her name is Jennifer Hines. But before all that, a little bit of the important news, which is the sea ice analysis for the Arctic sea ice. And this 3-year average sea ice volume trend is a part of what I call the Good Hope model for sea ice collapse. And The reason it's called Good Hope is because I live in Nuuk, which used to be called Godthåb in Danish, which translates to Good Hope in English. And the second reason it's called the Good Hope model is that this is a model for predicting when we will have a civilizational collapse, and therefore when this sort of global industrial, extremely repressive and destructive civilization will go away, and when the biosphere will be able to start over without that system of human society. So, I mentioned it's a 3-year annual volume trend, and the reason I'm bringing this up now is that we've just passed 13,500 cubic kilometers for the average 3-year or about 1,000-day average. So the 1,000-day average for sea ice volume is now lower than it's ever been. It's at 13,500 cubic kilometers, and I've also marked on this graph the major stepstones that we've gone since the 1980s for the 3-year average. So you have 23,000 in 1991, 22,000 in 95, 21,000 in 97, 20,000 in 2002, and 19,000 in 2005, 18,000 in 2006, 17,000 in 2007, 16,000 in 2010, 15,000 in 2011, and 14,000 in 2012. And then there was an uptick here, which is what you will see sometimes when you have a short-ish trend that is less than 9-year trend. You will have these upticks somewhere. But for the 9 and 10-year trends, you have no upticks. It's just a straight down, more or less down, but always down trend. So what I do is when I make projections is that I look at the for the 3-year trend, I look at the difference between the last 3 years, the average for the last 3 years, compared to the 3 years before that. So it's like 2015 to 2018 for the last part, and 2012 to 15 for the prior part. And if you take the difference between those 2 3-year periods, you get an annual decrease of 543 cubic kilometers, right now for this 13.5, the passing of the 13.5 line, and an annual decrease of 453 cubic kilometers means that we will be at a blue ocean event for half the year in about 18.9 years, so that's in 2037. So as I said, this 3-year trend and a projection is part of my larger data background for the Good Hope model, which currently projects a 2020 to 2024 deadline for when we will have a half year of no sea ice in the Arctic, and I look at all the 1 to 10-year trends in this larger research work. And of course, when you have 2037 as the current projection for the 3-year trend, that means that you have other trends that point to a lower or an earlier sea ice collapse date. Okay, and we'll return to the other longer term trend lines when we pass a similar threshold for those. Okay, so back to the insanely deceptive IPCC report. I mentioned sea ice volume already in the first part, and so amazingly you don't have in the latest UN Climate Panel report for the 1.5 degrees, you have no mention of the fact that last year, 2017, was the lowest year for sea ice or sea ice volume ever on record. They don't mention that at all, even though sea ice in the Arctic, of course, is a key indicator of how fast we are warming this planet. And of course, I didn't even mention the fact that the year before that, in 2016, we had the lowest year for sea ice extent, which otherwise, extent is otherwise the pet measure, the pet category for the IPCC. Whenever they talk about sea ice, they talk about two-dimensional sea ice extent, because that's not collapsing nowhere as fast as sea ice volume and thickness. But I don't even mention the fact that 2016 was the lowest year for sea ice extent. So over to the more serious failings of the IPCC report, or it's failing, according to what we expect from it, but of course it's not failing according to what their handlers tell them to report about. But this 1.5 degree report, they never tell us in the report itself, or in the summaries or anywhere. And of course they don't tell us in the press, in the popular press, when it's not even in the report. So they never tell us why they come out with this report, or why a limit for 1.5 or 2C is a limit. They seem to have forgotten about that completely. And for those of us who have a memory like an elephant, we can remember more than 1 year back in time, there was a point in time where they would talk about a limit at 1 degree or 1.5 degree or 2 degree Celsius warming since pre-industrial. And that was an important tipping point or limit that we should not cross, not just because it will be more flooding and more droughts and more hurricanes, stronger hurricanes and all that, or more sea level rise, but because it's the border between just unpleasant climate change, like too hot in many parts of the world, and a lost cause, a self-reinforcing, what's the word for that? A one-way street to a warmer world. They don't talk about that at all. So it's just like they have this UN dog and pony show where they talk about 1.5C, or we should limit our emissions, blah blah, and 1.5 is less severe than 2.0. Duh, of course, but they never go into the fact that if we get to a point more than 1.5 or whatever the scientific number would be, then you will not have a temperature graph for the globe that will peak at some point, flat line, and then go down again afterwards. But you will have a steadily increasing global temperature for thousands of years, tens of thousands of years, millennia, and it will go up and up and up until you have no ice at all on the planet. So this new IPCC report seems to have forgotten, the whole reason for setting an upper limit for temperature increase, and they don't like to talk about climate feedbacks, like if you get this much warmer, all the ice will go and that will release methane, and we will go warmer and warmer, and then we will lose all the methane in the permafrost in Siberia and in Canada and in Alaska and in Greenland. They don't like to talk about that because that's unpleasant. So that's why it's deceptive, and you shouldn't really believe anything from the headline of the report to the footnotes. You shouldn't believe anything in that report, because they basically just want you to be a little bit worried about the climate and maybe pay a little more for your gasoline, but basically just go about your life. And this is like, this whole climate issue is as important or as unimportant as the question of whether or not you should have free school lunch for children in your local school. And that's sort of where they want to place the whole climate debate. It's unimportant. This will be something for your grandchildren to worry about, and by then they will probably run their cars on palm oil, destroying the rainforest instead. And basically this is, nothing to see here. Move along. All right, that's Talking South for this week, and please subscribe to my channel when you finish watching this. And as I said, next Wednesday, we will have Jennifer Hines, the maker of 2 big documentary films about the methane monster, or the methane bomb, in our near future. So tune in Wednesday night at about 9 o'clock Greenland time. I can't remember all the other time zones. Okay.